A human skull coated in white plaster sits in a museum storage drawer in Ankara. It was excavated from beneath the floor of a house in south-central Turkey, a house that was rebuilt on the exact same footprint, layer upon layer, for nearly 4 centuries. Someone had pressed shell fragments into the eye sockets. Someone had painted the face back into position, not as a burial meant to be sealed away, as a presence meant to remain. The skull stayed inside the home among the living, perhaps handled during certain seasons, perhaps simply watched from a corner of the room. What the oldest walls still remember, it seems, is not only how people built, but how they chose with considerable care not to let the dead disappear. Tonight we'll move through 3 traces left behind by humanity's first cities: the walls themselves, the bones beneath the floors, and the things people made and kept in the dark of those earliest rooms. We won't arrive at clean conclusions. These places are too old and too strange for certainty. But we can follow what the evidence quietly suggests and see where it leads. The site is called Çatalhöyük. Some 9,000 years ago, between 5,000 and 10,000 people lived here, at any given time packed into mud-brick rooms with shared walls, no streets but ground level, and no doors. Every house was entered through a hole in the roof. You climb down by the ladder into a space roughly the size of a modern studio apartment where your family slept, cooked, made obsidian tools, and eventually were buried. The floor beneath you held the bones of your grandmother. The platform you slept on may have covered an infant sibling. This was not unusual. This was as far as the archaeological record can tell us simply how people lived. It is easy from this distance to reach for explanations, to say they were more comfortable with death than we are, to say they lacked our modern sense of separation between the living and the dead. But the evidence suggests something more deliberate than mere cultural habit. The plastered skulls, dozens, have been found across the site, show signs of repeated repainting. Some were handled over years, possibly decades. They were maintained. Whatever relationship these first city dwellers held with their ancestors, it was not passive. It was tended the way you tend something you are not ready to lose. Çatalhöyük was continuously inhabited for nearly 1,400 years. That is longer than the Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean, longer than the interval between the fall of Constantinople and today. 18 distinct building levels have been identified, each representing a generation or 2 of occupation, each following the same strange architectural logic. No streets, rooftop pathways worn smooth by thousands of feet, and beneath every floor the quiet accumulation of the dead. And yet for all that continuity, there is something the site still will not quite explain. Archaeologists have found no palace, no temple standing apart from the residential houses, no administrative complex, no royal burial an order of magnitude more elaborate than the rest. Some houses are slightly larger than others. Some contain more carefully executed wall paintings, leopards rendered life-sized against white plaster, geometric patterns that may, some researchers suggest, represent early attempts to map the surrounding landscape. But the basic organisation holds across all 18 levels, hundreds of nearly identical rooms, all accessed the same way, all oriented the same direction, all burying their dead beneath the same floors. 10,000 people living together, without an obvious centre of power for over a millennium. How conflicts were resolved, how resources moved between households, how strangers learned to share walls across generations, these remain in large part open questions. The architecture offers no straightforward answer. It only offers repetition and the suggestion that whatever held this place together was not visible in stone. Jericho offers a different kind of trace. Older than Çatalhöyük by a roughly 2,000 years, it had walls, actual stone walls 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, built at a time when most of humanity was still moving seasonally across open landscapes. Inside those walls stood a tower 28 feet tall, 28 feet wide at the base, with an internal staircase of 22 carved steps spiralling up to a flat platform at the top. Carbon dating places its construction at approximately 11,000 years ago, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid rose along the Nile. The tower's purpose is still debated among researchers. Defense is the obvious first answer, but some find it difficult to sustain. The Jordan Valley at that period was sparsely populated, and organised warfare as we tend to understand it may not yet have fully existed. Others suggest the tower was astronomical, possibly oriented toward the setting sun at the summer solstice, its shadow falling in alignment with a nearby mountain peak on a specific evening each year. Others still suggest it was neither defensive nor astronomical, but simply symbolic, a mark in the landscape, a way of saying we are here and we intend to remain. Two settlements. Two very different approaches to the same underlying problem. How do large numbers of people, not all related by blood, learn to live in permanent proximity without pulling apart? Çatalhöyük seems to have held itself together through density and memory as shared walls, shared rooftops, the weight of ancestral bone underfoot, social pressure flowing in every direction at once. Jericho seems to have answered through boundary, through the act of enclosure of drawing a stone line between inside and outside, between those who belong and those who pass through. Neither answer was permanent. Both experiments eventually ended, but both lasted long enough to change what came after, and the traces they left in plaster, in bone, in carefully stacked stone are still being read, still being revised, each excavation season adding something the previous one missed. We begin as the physical record does with the walls themselves, not as symbol but as fact stone placed on stone by hands that had no word for city, no concept of what they were starting, and no way to know that the question they were asking would still be open 11,000 years later. The world before walls. Around 13,000 years ago, on a limestone hillside somewhere above the Jordan Valley, a group of people made a decision so quiet it left almost no trace in the record. They stayed. Not through a single season, not through one good harvest of wild grain. They stayed long enough to build stone foundations, to dig storage pits into the earth, to wear smooth paths between the places where they slept and the places where they worked. The hillside was not unusual. The spring nearby was reliable. The wild barley grew thickly along the lower slopes, and the gazelle moved through the valley in numbers that a skilled hunter could count on. None of these things taken alone would explain the decision, but together they crossed some threshold that we have not fully mapped, and a group of people who had spent their entire lives in motion simply stopped. To understand what that choice cost and what it offered, it helps to understand the world these people were beginning almost imperceptibly to set down. For the previous 200,000 years or more, anatomically modern humans had lived as their ancestors had lived, in small bands, rarely more than 50 people moving with the seasons, tracking the availability of animals and plants across landscapes they knew with extraordinary precision. This was not a limited existence. The evidence suggests it was in many respects a rich one. Skeletal remains from mobile hunter-gatherer populations of this period show strong teeth, varied bone wear, consistent with diverse physical activity, and body proportions that suggest adequate nutrition across the lifespan. These were not people struggling at the edge of survival. They were experts at a way of life that had proven itself across every continent on Earth, except Antarctica. And that detail is worth pausing on because it complicates the story we often tell about why cities eventually appeared. The standard account moves in a clean line. Scarcity drives settlement, enables agriculture. Agriculture creates surplus, and surplus builds civilization. But the groups who first began to slow their movement in the Fertile Crescent were not by most evidence responding to scarcity. They were responding to abundance. The landscape at the end of the last ice age, as glaciers retreated northward and rainfall patterns shifted across the Middle East, produced something closer to a managed garden than a wilderness. Wild wheat and barley grew so densely across certain hillsides that a small group could harvest enough in a few weeks to sustain themselves for months. Gazelle herds moved through valleys on predictable seasonal routes. Rivers ran year-round, and the question was not how to find enough food. The question for certain groups in certain places was beginning to shift towards something more unfamiliar. What to do when you have more than you can carry. The people archaeologists call the Natufians were among the first to encounter this problem seriously. Named after Wadi Natuf in what is now Israel and the West Bank, where their remains were first identified in the 1920s, the Natufians occupied a broad arc of territory across the Levant between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They were still for the most part hunter-gatherers. They did not farm in any deliberate sense, but they were beginning to behave in ways that farming communities would later normalize. They built substantial stone structures, used ground stone tools to process grain, kept dogs as the earliest domesticated animal, and buried their dead in fixed locations, sometimes in small cemeteries, sometimes beneath the floors of their houses. That last practice will matter considerably later in this account. The decision to bury the dead in a specific permanent place is not merely logistical. It is a claim on the landscape. It's a way of saying that this ground belongs to our history and that we intend to return to it. And that is where the quiet problem begins, because once you have buried your dead somewhere, once the bones of your grandmother lie beneath a particular hillside, and the stones of a particular threshold have been worn smooth by your family's feet across a generation, leaving is no longer a neutral act. It becomes a kind of rupture. The Natufians, without any single deliberate decision, had begun to accumulate exactly these kinds of attachments to specific springs, specific grain fields, specific burial grounds, and the weight of those attachments would shape everything that followed, even when the climate turned against them. What shifted the Natufian experiment from promising to urgent was an event that had nothing to do with human choice. Around 12,800 years ago, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped sharply within what may have been decades. The exact mechanism is still debated. Though disruption of North Atlantic Ocean circulation is among the leading candidates. The warm, wet conditions that had turned the Fertile Crescent into a landscape of abundance collapsed with a speed that must have been bewildering to the people living through it. Wild grain retreated to scattered refuges. The gazelle herds thinned as the grasslands dried into scrub. The rivers became seasonal, where they had once been constant. Archaeologists call this period the Younger Dryas, a name borrowed from a small flowering plant that spread rapidly across Europe as tundra replaced forest. The name is considerably gentler than what it describes roughly 1,200 years of climatic instability that forced every human community in the affected regions to make a choice about what kind of people they intended to become. Some groups returned to full mobility. They dispersed following the fragmentary resources across wider territories, and their descendants are archaeologically harder to trace, which may itself be part of the story. Other groups had stayed, or perhaps more accurately, they had already stayed long enough that returning felt impossible, or that the accumulated knowledge required for full mobility had begun to fade across the generations, and staying when the wild food supply can no longer be counted upon produces its own kind of pressure. A pressure that would eventually, slowly across centuries of experiment and failure and incremental adaptation, produce something no one had planned for and no one could have named. We follow the second group now into the long uncertain beginning of everything that came after, the invention of staying. A single grain of domesticated wheat differs from its wild ancestor in one structural detail that seems almost too small to matter: the base of the seed. The point where it attaches to the stem is thickened and rigid rather than brittle and thin. In wild wheat, this brittleness is a survival mechanism. The seed snaps free. In the wind scatters, finds its own ground. In domesticated wheat, the seed holds. It stays attached until a human hand removes it. This change did not happen by design. No one in the ancient Fertile Crescent sat down and decided to breed a sturdier grain attachment. It happened because the people who were harvesting wild wheat, generation after generation, were unconsciously selecting for the plants that were easiest to collect the ones that hadn't already scattered before they arrived. Over centuries, almost without noticing, they were changing what wheat was, and wheat in return was changing them. This is the texture of the Neolithic Revolution that most summary accounts leave out. It was not a moment of invention. It was not a decision made by any single community or any single mind. It was a slow co-evolution, humans and plants and animals reshaping one another across hundreds of years of proximity, and it was driven less by ambition than by the particular desperation of groups who had during the Younger Dryas found themselves committed to places they could no longer easily leave. The climate had taken the abundance away. What remained was the memory of abundance, the infrastructure of settlement, the stone foundations, the storage pits, the buried dead, and the accumulated knowledge of which plants in which conditions produced the most grain. From that combination, something new emerged, not because anyone planned it, but because the alternative was starvation. The earliest deliberate cultivation appears in the archaeological record around 11,500 years ago, roughly coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas and the return of warmer, wetter conditions across the Fertile Crescent. But warmer conditions alone do not explain why certain communities began planting rather than simply returning to the harvesting of wild stands. Some researchers argue the critical factor was population pressure groups that had survived the cold period in fixed locations had grown dense enough that the surrounding wild resources, even as they recovered, could no longer sustain everyone. Others suggest it was the opposite, that the recovery of the climate made experimentation possible again, that people who had been surviving on stored grain and depleted herds now had enough stability to try something new. Both arguments have supporting evidence, and both are probably partially correct. What matters is that the experiment began, and once it began, it was very difficult to stop. The detail that rarely appears in popular accounts of this transition is how much worse, in measurable physical terms, early agriculture made people's lives. Skeletal collections from early farming communities across the Near East show a consistent pattern when compared with the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them: shorter average stature, more dental decay, higher rates of nutritional deficiency, markers in bone tissue and joint damage, consistent with highly repetitive physical labour beginning at young ages. The diversity of diet that mobile foraging provided, dozens of different plant species, varied cuts of meat, seasonal fruits and nuts, was replaced by a narrower reliance on a small number of cultivated crops, primarily wheat and barley, that were calorie-dense but nutritionally incomplete on their own. Early farmers were in a very specific sense less healthy than the people who came before them, and yet the communities that adopted agriculture grew, while communities that did not began over the following millennia to contract and disappear from the record. That contradiction, worse health outcomes or larger populations, is one of the quiet engines driving everything that follows. Agriculture was not better for individual bodies, it was better for group persistence. A farming community could support more people per unit of land than a foraging community could, and more people meant more labour, more stored surplus, more resilience against the kind of catastrophic harvest failure that would devastate a smaller group. The mathematics of collective survival favoured farming, even when the biology of individual health argued against it. This tension would echo forward across the entire history of urban civilization, reappearing in different forms but never fully resolving itself. The pattern of choosing collective persistence over individual well-being is already present, fully formed in the earliest agricultural communities of the ancient Near East. Animal domestication followed a similar logic and a similar timeline. The earliest domestic sheep and goats appear in the archaeological record of the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, around 10,500 to 10,000 years ago, followed by cattle and pigs in slightly later contexts across Anatolia and the Levant. Like the transition in plants, this process was gradual and unplanned in its early stages. Young animals captured and raised in proximity to human settlements, selected across generations for docility, for slower growth, for the particular behavioural plasticity that makes a wild animal manageable in captivity. The animals that survived in human company were the ones that tolerated it. Over time, tolerance became dependence, and the herds that resulted were fundamentally different organisms from their wild ancestors, smaller boned, more passive, less able to survive without human management. The relationship had become mutual, in a way that made separation increasingly difficult for both parties. By around 10,000 years ago, the combination of cultivated grain and managed livestock had created something that the Fertile Crescent had never seen before: a reliable, if fragile, food system that did not require movement to sustain. Communities could grow larger. Children could survive in greater numbers. The accumulated knowledge of specific fields, specific water sources, specific seasonal patterns could be passed down within a fixed location rather than carried across a landscape, and the dead increasingly could be buried where the living intended to remain. All of this created conditions that made the next step not inevitable. Nothing about what happened next was inevitable, but at least imaginable. The question of how many people could share a fixed place without the old mechanisms of mobility to release pressure was about to receive its first serious answer. The place that should not have existed. What draws 10,000 people to a single point on a plain, the Konya Basin in south-central Turkey, is not by any obvious measure a place designed to concentrate human life. It sits at a considerable elevation, exposed to cold winters and dry summers, without a major river running through it, and without the dramatic natural features: a defensible promontory, a sheltered harbour, a crossroads of mountain passes that explain the location of most ancient cities. The two rivers nearest to the site, the Sarkamba and a smaller seasonal stream, were useful but not exceptional. The surrounding plain was fertile enough capable of supporting grain cultivation across the wide, flat terraces that extended in every direction, but no more fertile than dozens of other locations across Anatolia. And yet sometime around 7,500 BCE people began arriving here in numbers that had no precedent anywhere on Earth. They built houses directly against one another, sharing walls following a layout so consistent across the entire settlement that it suggests not accident, but agreement, some collective understanding passed between households and across generations of what this place was supposed to be. The site is called Çatalhöyük, and the first thing to understand about it is that its location was almost certainly chosen for a reason that had nothing to do with agriculture. 60 miles to the northeast, visible on clear mornings as a dark shape against the pale sky, stood the twin volcanic peaks of Hasan Dağ. The mountain had been active in the human memory of the region. A wall painting found at Çatalhöyük, dated to around 6,600 BCE, appears to show an erupting volcano above a settlement of clustered buildings. And while some researchers dispute this interpretation, the image is striking enough that it has never been fully dismissed. But the volcano's significance was not primarily symbolic. Hasan Dağ and the volcanic landscape surrounding it were the source of obsidian, the black volcanic glass, that was in the technological context of the Neolithic period, among the most valuable materials in the known world. Obsidian fractures with a predictability and sharpness that no other naturally occurring stone can match. Edges produced by a skilled napper are at the microscopic level sharper than modern surgical steel, and the obsidian from the Cappadocian volcanic source is chemically distinctive enough to be traced back to specific outcrops has been found at sites across the entire Near East, from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf, in contexts dating back to at least 12,000 years ago. Çatalhöyük sat at a natural gathering point along the routes that connected these sources to the wider world, and that position, more than any agricultural advantage, may be what first drew people to the Konya Basin in significant numbers. The obsidian economy at Çatalhöyük was not a minor sideline to a primarily agricultural community. Excavations across the site have recovered obsidian in quantities and states of production that suggest something closer to an organised industry. Quarries blanks, finished tools, and the distinctive pressure-flaking debris of skilled knapping have been found in concentrations that indicate households specifically devoted to this work. Not full-time specialists in the modern sense, but families with accumulated expertise across generations, producing blades and scrapers and points, not only for their own use but for exchange across the networks that connected Çatalhöyük to communities hundreds of miles distant. The site appears to have functioned, at least in part, as a processing and redistribution hub. Raw obsidian came in from the volcanic sources. To the northeast was worked into finished or semi-finished forms by skilled households, and moved outward through trade relationships whose precise mechanisms we can only partially reconstruct. That the obsidian found its way so consistently to sites across such a wide geography suggests these were not casual exchanges between neighbouring villages. They were sustained relationships, probably maintained across generations, between communities that had agreed on the value of what was being traded and on the terms under which it would move. The pattern is worth noting carefully, because it means that Çatalhöyük was from its earliest layers a node in a larger system rather than a self-contained community. The 10,000 people who eventually lived there were not simply a farming village that had grown very large. They were participants in a regional economy that extended far beyond the Konya Basin, and the material wealth that this economy generated, access to high-quality tools to goods from distant communities, to the social connections that trade relationships sustained, was the part of what made the density of the settlement sustainable over time. You stayed at Çatalhöyük not only because the grain fields were adequate, but because the web of relationships centered on this place offered something that a smaller, more isolated community could not provide. The detail is small, but it refuses to go away. No settlement of this scale appears in the archaeological record of Anatolia or the Near East before Çatalhöyük. And when it appears already connected, already embedded in networks that suggest considerable preparation, even if no single moment of founding can be identified. The physical form of the settlement reinforces this impression of collective intention. The mud-brick houses were not scattered across the landscape and gradually drawn together as population increased. From the earliest identifiable building level, the structures are already packed tightly against one another, sharing walls following a consistent internal layout. a main room with plastered platforms along the walls, a hearth and oven. Storage bins set into the floor that holds with remarkable stability across all 18 buildings levels identified by excavators. Someone or many people working in agreement had decided from the beginning that this was how houses at this place should be built. The agreement was not written down. There were no architects, no city planners, no administrative body issuing building codes. And yet the consistency is there, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, as though the form of the house had become so deeply embedded in the community's understanding of itself that deviation would have required not merely a different choice, but a different identity. What the founding of Çatalhöyük required more than any particular resource or geographic advantage was a willingness to imagine a new kind of social unit, one that extended beyond the family, beyond the clan, beyond the kinship networks that had organized human life for hundreds of thousands of years. It required people to share walls with neighbors who were not relatives, to coordinate the use of shared rooftops with hundreds of households whose internal lives they could hear but not control, to trust in some functional, if not philosophical sense, that the person sleeping on the other side of a mudbrick partition would still be there tomorrow. How that trust was built, maintained, and occasionally broken is the question that the next layers of evidence begin slowly to address. A city without streets. The ladder was the most important object in Çatalhöyük. Not the obsidian blade, not the grinding stone, not the clay oven that occupied the southern corner of nearly every house, the ladder. A simple construction of wood and rope or carved timber leaned against the interior wall, beneath the single opening in the roof. It was the threshold between the private world of the household and the shared world above. You climbed it to leave. You descended it to return. Children learned to navigate it before they learned almost anything else about the physical world, and the elderly managed it with whatever agility remained to them, because there was no other way in or out. The entire social and spatial logic of the settlement flowed from this single architectural fact that ground level in the world's first large city was not where life happened. Life happened above. The rooftop system at Çatalhöyük was not merely a workaround for the absence of streets. It was a complete alternative to the street as a social technology. In a city organized around ground-level pathways, the street is where strangers become visible to one another, where commerce happens, where disputes play out publicly, where the boundary between your space and everyone else's space is negotiated continuously through movement and proximity. At Çatalhöyük, the roof performed all of these functions simultaneously, but with a crucial difference: the roof was shared in a way that a street never quite is. You did not simply pass through someone else's rooftop space. You traversed it daily as part of the ordinary geography of your life. The woman 3 houses over knew your footstep pattern. The family to the north knew which direction you came from in the morning and which direction you left in. The rooftop was a continuous surface across which everyone's movements were in principle observable to everyone else, and this visibility was not incidental. It was structural. Archaeologists working at the site since Ian Hodder's reinvestigation began in the 1990s have documented the wear patterns on the rooftop surfaces across multiple building levels, and those patterns reveal something interesting about the organization of movement through the settlement. Certain paths were used heavily and consistently across generations, worn into the mud brick surface in ways that suggest not random foot traffic, but established routes, habitual trajectories between specific points. The paths converge on areas that show evidence of communal activity: outdoor hearths, larger open courtyards where several households' rooftop spaces merged into something approximating a public square, areas with dense accumulations of food processing debris, suggesting that certain kinds of work were done collectively in the open air by groups of people from multiple households. The rooftop was not simply a highway. It was also, in certain areas and at certain times, a gathering place, a location where the boundaries between households dissolved into something that functioned, however informally, like a commons. Inside the houses themselves, the layout was so consistent across the site that walking into any one of them from any building level would have felt immediately familiar to anyone who had grown up in the settlement. The main room measured roughly 25 square meters, approximately the floor area of a generous modern studio apartment, with plastered sleeping and working platforms built along the northern and eastern walls, a domed clay oven in the south, a hearth positioned to draw smoke upward toward the roof opening, and storage bins recessed into the floor along the western edge. The plaster that covered every surface, floors, walls, platforms, even the oven exterior, was renewed repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times within a single occupation phase, producing a layered stratigraphy of white surfaces that, when excavated in cross-section, looks like the rings of a slow-growing tree. Each replastering was a small act of maintenance and renewal, the household reasserting its relationship with the physical space it occupied. Some researchers have suggested that replastering may have carried ritual significance beyond its practical function, that the act of covering and renewing the surfaces of the house was connected to the same impulse that led residents to repaint the plastered skulls of their ancestors, refusal to let things decay into illegibility, a continual effort to keep the past visible within the present. The northern wall of many houses carried the most elaborate decoration. Bull skulls and horn cores, bucrania were mounted directly into the plaster, projecting outward into the room at head height or slightly above their surfaces, coated in the same white plaster that covered everything else. Some installations involved a single pair of horns, others accumulated multiple sets over time, the earlier ones partially buried by subsequent layers of plaster and rebuilding, while the most recent set remained exposed. A room with 7 or 8 sets of bucrania embedded in its northern wall, accumulated across several generations of occupation, would have presented a particular quality of presence, not decorative, exactly not purely functional, but somewhere in the layered space between the two that is very difficult to name from this distance. The animals these horns came from were aurochs, wild cattle of a size and temperament that made hunting them among the most dangerous activities available to the settlement's inhabitants. The horns were trophies in the literal sense, but they may have been considerably more than that. Some researchers argue they functioned as markers of household status, each set representing a successful hunt and the social recognition that accompanied it. Others suggest their significance was primarily spiritual, that the mounted horns kept the power of the animal present within the domestic space in a way that served protective or ritual purposes. Both interpretations are plausible, neither is provable with current evidence, and the discomfort of that uncertainty is part of what keeps researchers returning to the question. What the internal architecture of Çatalhöyük does establish with reasonable confidence is that the house was not simply a shelter. It was a technology of memory and identity, a physical structure that accumulated the traces of its occupants across time through layers of plaster and successive installations of symbolic objects and the bones of the dead pressed into its floor, until the building itself became a kind of archive. To live in such a house was to inhabit your family's history in the most literal sense available, and that quality of the space, its density with accumulated time, shaped what it meant to belong to this place in ways that no map or census or administrative record could have replicated. What it meant to govern such a place, and whether anything like governance existed at all, is where the next layer of the evidence leads. The governance of proximity. In 18 successive building levels spanning nearly 1,400 years, archaeologists excavating Çatalhöyük have not found a single room that functions unambiguously as a throne room, an audience hall, or an administrative centre. They have not found a burial so dramatically more elaborate than its neighbours that it announces without question the presence of hereditary rulership. They have not found a storehouse large enough to suggest that grain was being collected as tribute and redistributed by a central authority. What they have found instead is a settlement of roughly equal households, equal in floor area, equal in basic material content, equal in the treatment accorded to their dead, that managed to sustain a population of between 5,000 and 10,000 people for over a millennium, without leaving any clear physical trace of the mechanisms by which it was governed. This absence is not a gap in the evidence. It is itself a kind of evidence, and it points toward a form of social organisation that sits uncomfortably outside the frameworks we most readily reach for when thinking about how cities work. The basic unit of organisation at Çatalhöyük appears to have been the household. Not the individual, not the clan in any extended sense, but the specific physical house, with its particular history of occupation and rebuilding and burial functioning, as the primary node through which resources, knowledge, identity and social standing were organised and transmitted. When a house was rebuilt as they were repeatedly on the same footprint across generations, the new structure inherited the social position of the one beneath it. The accumulated burials under the floor, the particular set of bucrania mounted on the northern wall, the specific trade relationships maintained with distant communities, the ritual knowledge held by the senior members of the household, All of this passed forward with the physical structure so that the house itself became a vessel of continuity in a way that transcended any individual lifetime. Archaeologists working at the site have identified a subset of buildings they call history houses, structures that show unbroken sequences of occupation and rebuilding, spanning the full duration of the settlement's existence, decorated more elaborately than their neighbours, containing more evidence of ritual activity, and appearing across multiple building levels in positions that suggest they served as focal points for communal gatherings of one kind or another. These were not palaces. Their floor areas were not dramatically larger than those of ordinary houses. But something about them carried weight in the community's understanding of itself, and that weight was rooted in depth of history rather than concentration of material wealth. The question of how conflict was managed in a settlement this dense is one that the physical evidence approaches only indirectly, but there are details in the record that reward careful attention. Several houses across different building levels at Çatalhöyük show doorways that were deliberately blocked with compacted rubble, not the gradual infill of abandonment, but an intentional sealing of access points, while the surrounding structure remained in active use. The pattern is specific enough that researchers have suggested these blocked doorways represent a form of social sanction, a household whose behaviour had violated some community norm, being partially isolated, its access to shared rooftop pathways or communal spaces restricted without being expelled from the settlement entirely. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests a system of graduated social consequence, punitive enough to matter, calibrated enough to preserve the basic fabric of the community operating without any visible enforcement apparatus. No guards, no jails, no written law, only the collective weight of a settlement in which everyone's movements were visible to everyone else, and in which the consequences of social exclusion were immediately and continuously felt. The sensory texture of that visibility is worth pausing on for a moment. In a city without streets where the primary pathways ran across shared rooftop surfaces, your daily movements were not conducted in the relative anonymity that ground-level urban life eventually made possible. Every crossing of a neighbour's roof, every descent through a roof hatch, every return from the grain fields or the obsidian workshops at the settlement's edge was visible in principle to anyone who happened to be on the roof at that moment. The smell of what your household was cooking drifted upward through the roof opening. The sounds of argument or celebration passed through shared mudbrick walls with very little attenuation. Children playing on the rooftops moved freely across surfaces that belonged in some nominal sense to specific households but functioned in practice as a continuous shared terrain. Privacy in Çatalhöyük was not a spatial condition. It was something negotiated through social convention, through the agreed-upon norms of attention and inattention that allowed 10,000 people to coexist in a space where physical separation was essentially impossible. The burial evidence adds another dimension to this picture, and it is one that has surprised researchers consistently across decades of excavation. Men and women at Çatalhöyük were buried with the same care, in the same locations beneath house floors, in the same flex position with grave goods of broadly comparable quality and variety. Some of the most elaborate burials, those accompanied by finely worked obsidian, by jewellery of bone and stone, by textiles that had partially survived, belonged to women. Some of the simplest belonged to men. Analysis of skeletal wear patterns shows that both sexes performed physically demanding labour, though with different emphases. Women's bones show the distinctive joint changes of prolonged grain grinding. Men's show the upper body development and healed fractures, consistent with hunting and heavy construction work. The division of labour was real, but the burial evidence suggests it did not translate into a hierarchy of value, that the work of grinding grain and the work of hunting aurochs were held at least in the material language of mortuary practice as equivalent contributions to the household's survival. That equivalence, if it was genuinely felt rather than merely performed in death ritual, represents something worth noting carefully, a social arrangement in which the most fundamental form of inequality that later civilizations would institutionalize had not yet been built into the architecture of daily life. How long that arrangement could have persisted, and what forces were already beginning to strain it in the settlement's later centuries, is a question the upper building levels of the site are only beginning to answer. What the evidence does not say, there is a version of Çatalhöyük that appears regularly in popular accounts of prehistory and documentary narration in museum exhibition text in the the kind of book that promises to reveal what civilization was really like before hierarchy corrupted it. In this version, the settlement stands as proof that humans lived without rulers, that women held equal status with men, that the first cities were egalitarian communities organised around shared spiritual practice rather than concentrated power. The plastered skulls become evidence of sophisticated ancestor veneration. The absence of palaces becomes evidence of democratic governance. The seated woman figurine becomes evidence of goddess worship. Each artifact in this reading confirms a coherent and appealing picture of a world organised differently from our own. The difficulty is that the archaeological record examined carefully does not quite say any of these things, and the gap between what the evidence shows and what we have sometimes wished it to show is itself worth examining. Begin with the question of equality. The burial evidence at Çatalhöyük does show men and women interred with broadly similar treatment across much of the settlement's history, and this is a genuine and significant finding that distinguishes the site from many later urban centres, where mortuary practice reflects sharp gender hierarchies. But similar treatment in death does not straightforwardly translate into equal status in life, and the skeletal evidence complicates the picture in ways that simpler accounts tend to smooth over. Women's bones at Çatalhöyük show significantly higher rates of the specific joint damage associated with prolonged repetitive grinding. A physically demanding task performed on knees and wrists for hours each day across a lifetime, while men's bones show injury patterns more consistent with variable and episodic physical stress. If labour was divided along these lines, and the skeletal evidence suggests it was then the question of whether that division was freely chosen or structurally enforced is one the bones cannot answer. The graves may tell us that both kinds of work were valued in the ritual language of burial. They do not tell us whether the woman who spent 30 years grinding grain experienced her life as equivalent in freedom and dignity to that of the man who spent the same years hunting. The detail is small, but it refuses to go away. The figurines present a similar problem. When James Mellart excavated Çatalhöyük in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he recovered dozens of small clay figures and interpreted them with considerable confidence as evidence of a mother goddess cult, a female-centered religious system that he believed characterized the earliest urban communities across the ancient Near East. The seated woman figurine found in a grain bin in 1961 became the centerpiece of this interpretation, a massive, powerful female form enthroned between two felines radiating authority. For several decades, this reading was widely accepted and enthusiastically amplified, particularly in popular writing that wanted to locate in the deep prehistoric past a matriarchal alternative to the patriarchal civilizations of recorded history. The problem is that subsequent excavation using more rigorous and systematic methods recovered many more figurines, male figures, animal figures, ambiguous figures, fragments that could not be definitively assigned to any category. And the picture that emerged from this larger sample was considerably less coherent than Mellart's original interpretation suggested. Some researchers now argue that the figurines were not primarily religious objects at all, but served a variety of purposes: teaching tools, household talismans, objects of play that varied by context and by the specific needs of the household that produced them. It may be natural that we looked for a goddess in the oldest city. It may be chance that we found one so readily. The discomfort is that we cannot be sure which interpretation the evidence genuinely supports. The question of governance is perhaps the most contested of all. The absence of palaces and administrative buildings at Çatalhöyük is real and it is significant. But absence of evidence is not, as any working archaeologist will acknowledge, the same as evidence of absence. Power at Çatalhöyük may have been organised in ways that left no monumental architectural trace through control of ritual knowledge, through management of trade relationships, through the accumulated social authority of households with long histories at the settlement. Some researchers have pointed to the history houses as candidates for this kind of invisible leadership, arguing that the families who occupied these structures across generations held influence that was real and consequential even if it was expressed through ceremony and custom rather than physical coercion. Others suggest that the obsidian trade, which required sustained relationships with distant communities and the management of considerable material value, was controlled by specific households whose economic position gave them leverage that the burial evidence alone would not reveal. These are plausible arguments. They are also at present difficult to test against the material record. and the honesty of the field requires acknowledging that we are in several important respects still guessing. What the evidence does say when read without the pressure to confirm any particular conclusion is something more modest and perhaps more interesting than the cleaner stories on either side. Çatalhöyük was a settlement of considerable social complexity that organised itself through mechanisms we do not yet fully understand, that maintained a degree of material equality across its households that is genuinely unusual in the comparative record of early urban communities, and that sustained this arrangement across a span of time long enough that it cannot be dismissed as an unstable transitional phase. Whether this represents a deliberate social philosophy, an emergent property of specific material conditions, or something else entirely is a question the site keeps open rather than answering. Some argue the egalitarianism was real and argue it was partial, performed in certain domains, while hierarchy operated quietly in others. The pattern returns in either case something held this place together for over a millennium, and we have not yet found a name for it that the evidence will comfortably support. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is possibly the most accurate thing the record has to offer. The wild inside the wall, on the northern wall of one house in building level 6 at Çatalhöyük, a pair of leopards face each other across a surface of white plaster. They are painted life-sized, their spots rendered individually with a precision that suggests the artist had spent considerable time in close observation of the actual animal, close enough to study the way the rosette pattern shifts across the haunches, the way the shoulder muscles bunch above the foreleg, the specific angle at which the head turns when the animal is alert rather than relaxed. The leopards are not posed in any obviously symbolic arrangement. They are not flanking a deity or supporting a throne. They simply face each other at eye level on the wall of a room where a family slept and cooked and ground grain and buried their dead. No explanation for their placement has achieved consensus among researchers. They are there, and they are very carefully observed, and what they meant to the people who lived with them is a question the paint itself cannot answer. The presence of leopards on the walls of Çatalhöyük is a recurring fact across multiple building levels and multiple structures, and it sits in instructive tension with what we know about the settlement's relationship with wild animals more broadly. Çatalhöyük was not a hunting community in any primary sense. Its inhabitants farmed wheat and barley, managed increasingly domesticated sheep and goats in pens outside the settlement's edge, and traded obsidian across networks that connected them to communities hundreds of miles distant. The wild aurochs, the massive, dangerous ancestor of domestic cattle, was still hunted, and the frequency of aurochs bone in the settlement's refuse suggests that hunting remained a significant source of prestige, if not of daily nutrition. But the leopard was something different. There is no evidence that leopards were hunted systematically at Çatalhöyük, no accumulation of leopard bones in refuse deposits suggesting regular predation. The leopard appears on the walls not as prey, but as presence, not as something the community consumed, but as something it chose to live with visually within the most intimate domestic space it occupied. Some researchers have suggested that the leopard paintings functioned as markers of household identity or status, that the family capable of commissioning or producing such imagery was signalling something about its position within the settlement's social hierarchy. Others have proposed a more directly ritual interpretation, arguing that the leopard as an apex predator, as the animal most capable of killing a human in the landscape around the settlement, was being incorporated into the domestic space as a form of protective invocation, a way of claiming the leopard's power as an ally, rather than acknowledging it as a threat. A third line of argument holds that the paintings are evidence of something older and more diffuse, a residual relationship with the non-human world that the first city dwellers had not yet learned to fully suppress, a way of keeping the wild present within the walls precisely because the act of building walls had begun the long process of excluding it. That tension between the human-made order of the settlement and the non-human world pressing against its edges runs through the material culture of Çatalhöyük in ways that are too consistent to be accidental and yet too ambiguous to resolve into a single interpretation. The vulture paintings represent perhaps the most discussed example of this tension. Across several buildings at Çatalhöyük, large birds with wingspans rendered at or near actual scale are depicted in scenes that appear to involve human bodies. The birds are positioned above or around what some researchers read as headless human figures, bodies, in postures of collapse or abandonment, surrounded by birds that are not merely present, but actively engaged with the remains. The scenes are not comfortable to look at. They carry an emotional weight that survives the distance of 9,000 years and the complete loss of the cultural context in which they were made. And they have generated an unusually wide range of interpretations among the researchers who have studied them, ranging from evidence of actual sky burial practices, the deliberate exposure of the dead to scavenging birds as a mortuary custom, to symbolic representations of the soul's departure from the body, to depictions of mythological narratives that we have no other way of accessing. Some researchers argue the images are literally documentary, that bodies were carried outside the settlement and exposed to vultures before the defleshed bones were retrieved for burial beneath house floors, and that the paintings record this process as a matter of factual representation. Others find the documentary reading too literal, arguing that the images are operating in a register that is more clearly symbolic, that the vultures and the bodies together are encoding a cosmological understanding of death and transformation that the settlement held collectively, but that we cannot reconstruct from visual evidence alone. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the people of Çatalhöyük were thinking carefully and consistently about the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human body and the non-human world that waited to receive it, and that this thinking was expressed through visual art of considerable sophistication placed in the rooms where daily life was conducted. The dead were beneath the floor. The dangerous animals were on the walls. The sky, reachable only through the single opening in the roof, was the direction from which light and air and the possibility of departure all arrived. This arrangement of the physical world above, within, below, suggests a spatial cosmology, a way of organizing the universe into layers that corresponded to different categories of existence. Whether this cosmology was formally articulated, taught in any explicit way, or simply absorbed through the experience of growing up in rooms arranged according to its logic, is impossible to determine, but the consistency of the arrangement across 18 building levels and more than a millennium of occupation argues against its being accidental. The geometric paintings that covered other walls in the settlement's houses add further dimension to this picture. Dense networks of diamond shapes, parallel lines, and interlocking angular forms covered large sections of interior wall. Plaster in many buildings, sometimes in combination with the figurative leopard or vulture imagery, sometimes alone. A small number of researchers have proposed with considerable caution that certain of these geometric compositions may represent topographic features of the landscape around the settlement, that what appears to be an abstract pattern may in fact be an early attempt at cartographic representation, encoding the positions of hills, watercourses, or agricultural fields in a two-dimensional visual language. The proposal remains contested, and the honest assessment is that the evidence for it is suggestive rather than conclusive. But the possibility is worth holding open, because if it is correct, it pushes the origins of abstract spatial thinking considerably further back than the conventional timeline suggests, and it raises the question of what else these painted rooms may have been recording that we have not yet learned to read. The answer to that question, if it exists, lies not in the walls but in the floors beneath them, where the settlement kept its most carefully preserved secrets. The dead beneath the living. A burial excavated from building level 7 at Çatalhöyük contains the remains of at least 8 individuals interred across different periods of the house's occupation: a grandmother, 2 adult males, several children, an adolescent whose age at death the bone analysis places between 14 and 17 years. They do not lie in any ceremonially elaborate arrangement. There are no grave goods of exceptional quality, no evidence of prolonged or complex ritual preparation. The bodies were tightly flexed knees, drawn to chest, arms, folded inward, wrapped in organic material that has largely dissolved but left faint impressions in the soil, and lowered into shallow pits, dug through the house floor and into the compacted earth beneath. The pits were refilled carefully, the floor replastered over them, and life in the house continued above. What makes this burial, and the hundreds of others like it across the site, remarkable is not its elaboration, but its location directly beneath the sleeping platforms, beneath the hearth, beneath the very surfaces across which the household conducted its daily existence. The dead at Çatalhöyük were not set apart. They were incorporated literally and permanently into the fabric of the living space. The practice of floor burial was not unique to Çatalhöyük. earlier Natufian communities had buried their dead beneath house floors, and the custom appears across a range of Neolithic sites in the ancient Near East with sufficient frequency to suggest that it reflected a widespread and deeply held understanding of what death meant and what the dead required. But Çatalhöyük practiced floor burial on a scale, and with a consistency that goes beyond anything seen at comparable sites, and the details of how the practice was maintained across the settlement's long history reveal something about the relationship between the living and the dead that resists easy categorization. In some houses, skeletal analysis shows that bodies were not placed directly into their final positions at death, but were instead allowed to decompose elsewhere, possibly outside the settlement, possibly in secondary locations within it, before the defleshed bones were collected and brought inside for burial. The process of excarnation, as researchers call it, is attested at several Near Eastern sites of this period, and the vulture paintings discussed in the previous chapter may record one of the methods by which it was accomplished. What matters here is the implication that the bones brought back into the house were chosen and retrieved deliberately from a process of transformation and placed beneath the floor as the final stage of a procedure that involved both the community and the non-human world in the management of the body's passage from one state to another. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Çatalhöyük has added an unexpected dimension to this picture. By measuring the ratios of strontium and oxygen isotopes preserved in tooth enamel, which forms during childhood and records the geochemical signature of the water and food consumed in the first years of life, researchers have been able to identify individuals buried at the site who were not born there. Some proportion of the dead at Çatalhöyük, the analysis suggests, spent their early childhoods in other locations, arriving at the settlement as adults or adolescents and dying there years or decades later. They were then buried beneath the floors of houses alongside individuals whose isotope signatures indicate local birth across multiple generations. This finding complicates the picture of Çatalhöyük as a closed, self-reproducing community, and suggests instead a settlement that absorbed newcomers across its long history, people who arrived from other communities, perhaps through marriage networks or trade relationships, and who were eventually incorporated into the household structure fully enough that their bones were interred alongside those of the founding lineage. The house floor in this reading was not only a family archive, it was a site where membership in the community was confirmed and made permanent through the final act of burial. You were not fully of this place until you were beneath its floor. The plastered skulls represent the most striking expression of this relationship, and also the most difficult to interpret with confidence. At several points across the site's history and context distributed across multiple building levels and multiple structures, excavators have recovered human skulls that were removed from burials after their flesh had decomposed, coated in fine plaster and modelled to recreate facial features, the curve of cheekbones, the shape of the nose, the clothesline of lips, with a care and skill that varies between examples but is never perfunctory. Shell fragments were pressed into the eye sockets of some specimens, lending them a quality of arrested attention, a sense of regarding rather than merely being regarded. The skulls were then kept within the house, positioned in niches or on platforms, sometimes repainted across multiple episodes of renewed attention that extended over years or possibly decades. Some show evidence of handling wear patterns on the plaster surface consistent with being picked up and held repeatedly. That suggests they were not simply displayed but actively used, incorporated into practices whose specific nature the material evidence cannot reconstruct. What can be said is that they were maintained, returned to, kept present in the domestic space with a consistency of attention that implies ongoing significance rather than one-time commemoration. The sensory reality of living in such a house, sleeping on a platform beneath which your grandmother's bones lay, cooking at a hearth above the remains of children who had not survived infancy, looking across the room at a plastered face watching from a niche, is one that modern frameworks of the relationship between the living and the dead are not well equipped to process. The instinct is to reach for psychological explanations, the comfort of felt presence, the management of grief through ritual proximity, the social utility of ancestor veneration in a community where inherited identity carried practical weight. All of these explanations are plausible, and none of them is sufficient. The people of Çatalhöyük were not doing something that can be fully translated into the categories we bring to it. They were operating within an understanding of what a person was, what death changed, and what the dead continued to be, that the walls and floors they left behind can gesture toward, but cannot make fully transparent. The gesture is clear enough, however, to establish one thing with reasonable confidence, that for the people of this settlement, the boundary between the living household and its accumulated dead was not a boundary in any sense we would recognize. It was a threshold permeable in both directions, across which presence and obligation moved continuously in both directions, and which the architecture of the house was designed not to seal, but to maintain. The cost written. In bone the whole bone. One woman's skeleton, excavated from a middle building level at Çatalhöyük, tells a story that the surrounding architecture does not. Her age at death is estimated between 35 and 45 years middle-aged, by any standard old by the standards of her time and place. Her teeth are largely gone lost not to violence or accident, but to decay advanced enough that several roots had abscessed the infection, spreading into the surrounding jawbone and leaving lesions that, in a world without any effective treatment, would have produced chronic pain across years of her life. Her knees show the cartilage erosion of prolonged compressive stress consistent with spending many hours each day in a kneeling or squatting position. Her lower vertebrae are compressed and remodeled in ways that suggest decades of forward-bent posture under load. Her arm bones carry asymmetric muscle attachment, markings the right side more developed than the left in a pattern that appears repeatedly in female skeletons across the site, and that researchers have connected through experimental replication studies to the specific motion of pushing and pulling a grinding stone across a stationary surface for extended periods. She ground grain, most likely from childhood, until her body could no longer manage it, and then she was buried beneath the floor of the house where she had done this work, and the floor was replastered above her, and the household continued. Her skeleton is not unusual. It is in the relevant details representative of a pattern visible across the female skeletal collection from Çatalhöyük, with a consistency that rules out individual variation and points instead to a structural feature of life in the settlement. Grain grinding was not an occasional task. It was a daily necessity that the nutritional requirements of a population of this size made inescapable, and the bodies of the women who performed it across their lifetimes bear the cumulative record of that necessity in their joints and bones and dental remains. The work was not merely demanding in the way that all physical labour is demanding. It was repetitive in a specific sense that differentiates it from the varied physical demands of mobile foraging. The same motion in the same direction against the same resistance performed thousands of times across a lifetime until the body has literally reshaped itself around the task. Early agriculture created this kind of labour. Dense settlement made it unavoidable, and the people who bore its costs most directly were at Çatalhöyük, almost certainly the women whose burial evidence shows us equivalent ritual treatment in death, but whose skeletal evidence shows us something considerably less equal in life. The disease burden of Çatalhöyük adds another layer to this picture, and it is one that the settlement's inhabitants had no framework for understanding. Tuberculosis, lesions, the characteristic erosive marks left on bone by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, in cases severe enough to affect the skeleton, appear in the skeletal collection from Çatalhöyük, with a frequency that places the settlement among the earliest documented sites of this infection anywhere in the world. TB is what epidemiologists call a density-dependent pathogen. Its transmission requires sustained close contact between individuals, the kind of contact that scattered bands of mobile foragers rarely maintained long enough for the disease to establish itself within a population. Pack several thousand people into shared mud-brick rooms with smoke-thickened air circulating through a single roof opening, with multiple family members sleeping on platforms separated by arm's length, and the pathogen finds exactly the conditions it requires. The people who develop the wasting cough, the recurring fever, the slow decline that could extend across months or years, had no way of knowing that the settlement itself was the mechanism of their illness. They knew only that some people sickened in this particular way, and that the sickness was very difficult to recover from, and that those who did not recover were eventually buried beneath the floor with the same care accorded to everyone else. Intestinal parasites compounded the disease burden in ways the skeletal record can only partially capture, because soft tissue evidence rarely survives 9,000 years. But the sanitation conditions visible in the archaeological record of Çatalhöyük refuse accumulating in the narrow spaces between buildings animal pens maintained at the settlement's periphery, but close enough to contaminate water sources, the absence of any drainage system sophisticated enough to separate waste from living areas, created conditions well suited to the transmission of hookworm, roundworm, and the waterborne pathogens responsible for the chronic diarrheal illnesses that remain even today among the leading causes of child mortality in dense settlements without clean water infrastructure. Childhood mortality at Çatalhöyük appears to have been high based on the proportion of juvenile burials within the household floors, though the precise rates are difficult to establish given the excavation's incomplete coverage of the site. What the burial assemblage does show is that infant and child death was common enough to be a routine feature of household experience absorbed into the same domestic framework of floor burial and continued co-residence that managed the deaths of adults. The average life expectancy at Çatalhöyük, calculated from the skeletal assemblage, with all the caution appropriate to such estimates, falls somewhere in the mid-30s to early 40s for individuals who survive childhood, lower than comparable estimates for mobile hunter-gatherer populations of the same broad period and lower than the numbers would need to be for urban living to appear on straightforward biological terms as an improvement over what came before it. And yet the settlement grew, maintained its population and continued for over a millennium. The people who lived and died there were not presumably unaware that life was hard. They could observe the toll of grain grinding on aging bodies, the progression of the wasting cough through a household, the frequency with which children did not survive their first years. They made their calculations, or rather they lived within conditions that made calculation largely beside the point, and the settlement persisted. What it offered that the bones do not record, what it provided that made the costs visible in those bones worth sustaining, across generation after generation, is the question that the next layer of the evidence begins quietly to address: the other experiment. Roughly 900 kilometers to the southwest of Çatalhöyük, in the deep depression of the Jordan Valley at a point that sits nearly 250 meters below sea level, the lowest permanently inhabited location on Earth, a spring pushes approximately 1,000 gallons of fresh water out of the limestone bedrock every minute without interruption across every season and every year that the geological record allows us to examine. The spring is still flowing. It has been flowing at roughly this rate for at least 10,000 years, and possibly considerably longer. Around it, sometime before 9000 BCE, making it contemporaneous with the earliest layers of Çatalhöyük and in some respects considerably older. A community assembled that would eventually enclose itself within walls of cut stone 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, build a tower of a scale, an internal sophistication that would not be matched anywhere in the Near East for several thousand years, and establish a settlement pattern so different from that of the Anatolian plateau that the two sites taken together begin to look less like variations on a single theme and more like genuinely separate answers to the same underlying question. The spring at Jericho made permanence possible. What the community did with that permanence is what makes the site worth examining alongside Çatalhöyük rather than simply after it. The walls of Jericho are the detail that has attracted the most attention across the longest period of time, partly because of their association with the biblical narrative that has shaped Western understanding of the site since antiquity, and partly because of their sheer physical improbability in the context of when they were built. When Kathleen Kenyon excavated the tell of ancient Jericho between 1952 and 1958, she was not the first archaeologist to work at the site, but she was the first to apply the stratigraphic methods that allowed her to date the earliest defensive circuit with any precision. The result, a carbon date placing the construction of the stone wall and the associated tower at approximately 8000 BCE, with some evidence suggesting earlier phases of activity at the site reaching back to 9500 BCE or beyond, was received by the archaeological community with a combination of excitement and discomfort that has not entirely resolved itself in the decades since. The discomfort comes from what the date implies that people who had not yet invented pottery, who were only beginning the transition to deliberate agriculture, who had no writing and no metal, and no administrative technology of any kind that we can identify in the archaeological record, organised themselves sufficiently to quarry, transport and stack thousands of tons of stone into a structure of considerable engineering sophistication. The tower alone, circular 8.5 metres in diameter at the base, 8.5 metres tall, with an internal staircase of 22 steps cut directly into the stone, required not only physical labour on a scale that implies coordinated work parties of considerable size, but also planning across a timescale that extended beyond any single construction season, and almost certainly beyond any single individual's direct supervision. What the tower was for remains genuinely open. The defensive interpretation that it formed part of a circuit designed to protect the settlement against human attackers is the most intuitive reading of a tall stone structure built against a high stone wall, and it has the advantage of explaining why you would invest so much labour in something of this kind. But the defensive interpretation runs into difficulties that researchers have been pointing out since Kenyon's original publication. The Jordan Valley in the 9th millennium BCE was not densely populated. The archaeological record of this period shows no clear evidence of the kind of organised inter-group violence, mass burials with embedded projectile points, skeletal trauma patterns consistent with battle injuries, burned settlement layers that tends to accompany true warfare in later periods. The walls of Jericho appear before the social conditions that normally produce walls of this kind, which is either evidence that our understanding of those conditions is incomplete, or evidence that the walls were built for reasons other than the ones we most readily assume. Some researchers have proposed flood control. The spring that made Jericho possible also made it vulnerable to flash flooding during the rainy season, and a stone barrier of sufficient height and thickness could have redirected water away from the settlement's core. The proposal is hydraulically plausible, but architecturally awkward because flood barriers do not typically require internal staircases that allow people to ascend to a platform at the top. The astronomical interpretation of the tower has attracted increasing attention in recent years, and while it remains a minority position, it rests on a physical observation that is difficult to dismiss. Analysis of the tower's orientation and the topography surrounding the site suggests that on the evening of the summer solstice, the shadow of a prominent hill to the northwest of the settlement falls across the tower at the moment of sunset, briefly placing it in shade before the surrounding landscape loses the light entirely. If this alignment was intentional, and intentionality is precisely what cannot be proven from the physical evidence alone, it would mean that the tower was functioning as a marker of seasonal time, a device for anchoring the community's agricultural calendar to an astronomical event that was both observable and predictable. The solstice shadow is there whether or not anyone built to receive it, and the tower is there whether or not anyone oriented it to be shadowed. The relationship between the two is suggestive enough that some researchers find it compelling and honest enough that others find it unconvincing. What it points towards in either case is the possibility that the earliest monumental architecture was not primarily about defence or storage or the demonstration of political power, but about something more difficult to name, a desire to locate the human community in relation to larger rhythms of time and sky that the settlement, by becoming permanent, had committed itself to tracking. The economy of early Jericho was organised around the spring and around the settlement's position at a natural crossroads in the Jordan Valley, where movement between the Mediterranean coast, the highland plateau, and the territories to the east and south converged on the reliable water source. Obsidian from Anatolian volcanic sources, the same material that anchored Çatalhöyük's trade networks, has been found at Jericho, in quantities that confirm sustained contact with communities hundreds of miles to the north. Shells from the Red Sea appear alongside materials from the Mediterranean coast. The settlement was not producing a single exportable commodity the way Çatalhöyük's obsidian workshops were, but it was positioned to function as a node through which a wide variety of goods and the people carrying them could pass, rest and exchange. The spring was in a sense the trade good, reliable fresh water at the lowest and driest point of a sort of major regional corridor available to anyone who arrived at Jericho, and available on terms set by the community that controlled access to it. This difference in economic logic, Çatalhöyük as a production centre, Jericho as a transit node, may help explain the difference in their spatial organisation. Where Çatalhöyük packed its population into a dense streetless honeycomb that maximised internal cohesion at the cost of permeability to outsiders, Jericho maintained a settlement with more internal space, clearer pathways between structures, and a boundary, the wall that explicitly distinguished between those inside and those outside. The wall did not only keep things out, it kept something in a particular definition of membership, of who belonged to this place and on what terms. That definition, encoded in stone rather than in the shared mudbrick of Çatalhöyük's party walls, represents a different theory of what a city is, and what it is, for one whose implications would unfold across the following millennia, in ways that neither settlement's founders could have anticipated. The long unravelling. Sometime around 5700 BCE in the upper building levels of Çatalhöyük, something begins to shift in the material record that is difficult to name precisely but impossible to overlook once you know to look for it. The houses in these later layers are slightly smaller than their predecessors, not dramatically, so not in ways that would be immediately apparent to someone walking through the settlement, but measurably smaller when the floor areas are plotted across building levels and compared. The wall paintings become less frequent, and where they appear they are executed with less care, the leopards less anatomically precise, the geometric patterns less densely worked, the replastering episodes less regular. Some rooms that in earlier levels would have carried elaborate crania installations on their northern walls show instead bare plaster, or plaster interrupted by a single horn installation rather than the accumulated series of previous centuries. The burials beneath the floors continue, but the grave goods associated with them become simpler, the evidence of ritual preparation less elaborate. None of these changes taken individually would constitute proof of decline. Together across multiple structures and multiple building levels, spanning what the stratigraphy suggests was several generations of occupation, they describe it a community under pressure, not collapsing suddenly, but slowly releasing its grip on the standards of elaboration and investment that had characterized its long middle period. The environmental evidence for what was generating that pressure has been accumulating steadily since systematic paleobotanical and zooarchaeological analysis began at the site in the 1990s. Wood charcoal recovered from hearths in the earliest building levels at Çatalhöyük includes oak, juniper and hackberry species that indicate mature woodland within practical distance of the settlement, accessible as fuel and construction timber without prohibitive effort. By the middle building levels, the charcoal assemblage begins to shift. The mature oak diminishes, replaced by smaller diameter wood, consistent with scrubland species and secondary growth, the kind of vegetation that establishes itself after primary forest has been cleared and not allowed sufficient time to regenerate. In the upper building levels, the shift is more pronounced still, with evidence of dung fuel, pressed and dried animal dung used as a combustible when wood has become scarce appearing in hearth deposits with a frequency that suggests it was no longer a fallback but a primary fuel source for at least some households. The forest that had surrounded the settlement when it was founded had been worked for nearly 1,000 years, and it had not recovered at the rate it was being consumed. Soil exhaustion tells a parallel story. Archaeobotanical analysis of crop remains from different building levels shows a gradual decrease in the average seed size of the wheat and barley recovered from storage contexts, a change that agricultural ecologists associate with declining soil fertility as plants under nutrient stress produce smaller seeds even when the crop is not visibly failing. The fields that had fed Çatalhöyük's population across its long history were by the settlement's final centuries producing less per unit of cultivated area than they had in earlier periods, and the community had no access to the soil. Management techniques systematic, following the application of animal manure in quantities sufficient to restore nutrient levels. The total was crop rotation and involving nitrogen-fixing legumes that would eventually allow later agricultural communities to sustain productivity across longer timeframes. They were farming the same ground their ancestors had farmed for generations, and the ground was wearing out beneath them in ways they could observe in the harvest, but could not easily remedy with the tools and knowledge available to them. Water availability may have compounded the agricultural decline through a mechanism that the settlement's own growth had set in motion. The root systems of mature woodland play a significant role in regulating how rainfall moves through a landscape, slowing surface runoff, reducing erosion, allowing water to percolate into the soil and recharge the springs and seasonal streams that agricultural communities depend on. Deforestation disrupts this regulation, producing landscapes that flood more dramatically after heavy rain and dry out more severely between rain events. The Konya Basin around Çatalhöyük is not a landscape with large permanent rivers. The settlement depended on seasonal streams and the water-retaining capacity of vegetated soil, and the progressive removal of the woodland cover that had surrounded it since its founding would have made the local hydrology increasingly unpredictable across the settlement's later centuries, with the consequences for agricultural reliability that its inhabitants could feel in drought years without necessarily being able to trace back to the forest clearance that had caused them. Resource depletion of a different kind was also restructuring the economic relationships that had given Çatalhöyük much of its regional significance. The obsidian trade that had anchored the Sestermondida's prosperity for centuries depended on continued access to the Cappadocian volcanic sources, Hasan Dağ, and the related outcrops to the northeast, and on the maintenance of the distribution networks through which worked. Obsidian moved southward and westward to communities across the ancient Near East. As the Neolithic period progressed across Anatolia and the Levant, the number of communities with access to obsidian sources either directly or through their own trade relationships increased. Çatalhöyük's position as a privileged node in the obsidian network was not permanent, and the upper building levels show some evidence of reduced obsidian concentration relative to earlier periods, a pattern consistent with the settlements losing ground in a distribution system that was becoming more diffuse and more competitive as other communities developed their own access routes and processing capabilities. The detail is small, but it suggests that the economic conditions that had helped make Çatalhöyük viable at the scale it had achieved were not static, and that the settlement's position within the regional system was eroding alongside its local environmental base. Social cohesion, too, shows signs of strain in the later building levels. The burial assemblage from the upper layers of the site includes examples of interments with significantly more elaborate grave goods than the surrounding burials. Not dramatically, so by the standards of later urban societies, but noticeably more so by the standards of Çatalhöyük's own earlier periods, when the material content of burials was distributed with a consistency that suggested active maintenance of rougher quality. Some later burials contain multiple obsidian tools of fine quality, elaborate personal ornaments of bone and stone and shell, and evidence of textile goods that did not survive but left impressions in the surrounding soil. If the egalitarianism of the settlement's middle period was partly a function of the social mechanisms of peer policing and household accountability described earlier in this account, then the weakening of those mechanisms as environmental stress and economic change altered the conditions that had made them effective, would have allowed existing differences in household wealth and social capital to become more visible and more consequential in the material record. The community that had held itself together for over a millennium through the accumulated weight of shared architecture and shared tradition was in its final generations becoming something slightly different from what it had been not yet stratified, in the sense that later urban societies would become stratified, but no longer as flat as the building levels beneath it suggested it had once been. By approximately 5600 BCE, the settlement was empty. The last fires in the last hearths had gone cooled. The last ladder had been removed or had rotted in place. The roof openings through which generations of inhabitants had climbed into the morning air were open to a sky that no longer had anyone below them to observe it, and the plastered faces in their niches regarded rooms that would remain undisturbed until excavators began in 1958 to carefully reverse 9,000 years of accumulated silence. What left with the people who walked away from Çatalhöyük was not the end of the urban experiment, but the beginning of its dispersal, and it is that dispersal, spreading outward across the landscape like seeds from a plant that has finally gone to flower, that the last chapter of this account follows into the long distance of what came after. What the walls still hold. The people who left Çatalhöyük did not leave into emptiness. By 5600 BCE, the landscape of the ancient Near East was already dotted with settlements of varying scale, farming villages along river terraces, trading posts at natural crossroads, communities that had been absorbing the knowledge of how to live in permanent proximity for generations, learning from the successes and failures of the experiments that had preceded them. The departure from Çatalhöyük was not an ending, but a redistribution, households dispersing outward across a landscape that was, for the first time in human history, genuinely prepared to receive them. The knowledge of how to build a mudbrick wall, how to manage a grain storage pit through a dry summer, how to negotiate the use of shared space with neighbours who were not relatives, all of this travelled with the people who walked away from the Konya Basin, carried in practice and habit, and the embodied memory of having grown up in a particular kind of place. It did not need to be written down. It was already inside them. The archaeological record of the centuries following Çatalhöyük's abandonment shows this dispersal with a clarity that is almost geographic, a spreading pattern of settlement across Anatolia and the Levant and the river valleys of Mesopotamia, each new community building on the accumulated knowledge of those that had come before each generation, pushing slightly further against the boundaries of what a settled community could sustain. By 5000 BCE, permanent settlements of several hundred people were common across a broad arc of territory, extending from the Aegean coast to the western margins of the Iranian plateau. By 4500 BCE, communities in the river delta of southern Mesopotamia, the flat, flood-prone land between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the two rivers approached the Persian Gulf, were beginning to develop the irrigation agriculture and administrative complexity that would eventually produce the first cities of a recognizably different scale. Uruk, by approximately 3500 BCE, housed a population estimated between 25,000 and 50,000 people within its walls, a number that would have been incomprehensible to the founders of Çatalhöyük, and that required social technologies writing among them that the Neolithic world had not yet needed and could not yet have imagined. But the line between Uruk and Çatalhöyük is not a line of discontinuity. It is a line of elaboration of the same fundamental questions being asked at larger scales, with more sophisticated tools under more complex social conditions. How do large numbers of people who are not related by blood sustain cooperative relationships over time? How do community manage the tension between individual household interest and collective welfare? How do the dead remain present enough to anchor the living without consuming so much of the living's attention and resources that the present becomes unmanageable? These were the questions that the mudbrick rooms of Çatalhöyük were already working through imperfectly and without any guarantee of success 9,000 years before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. The answers that emerged from that working through partial provisional, frequently abandoned and reinvented, form the substrate on which everything that came after was built. Jericho too left traces that outlasted its own occupation. The principle encoded in its stone wall that a community could define itself through a physical boundary, could claim a particular piece of ground as belonging to a particular group of people, and construct something solid to mark that claim, became one of the organizing ideas of urban civilization across every subsequent period and geography. Walls went up around cities across the ancient world, not always because the military situation demanded them, but because the wall had become in some deep cultural sense what a city was: a bounded place, a defined interior, a threshold between belonging and not belonging, that the stone itself made legible to anyone approaching from outside. The tower at Jericho, reaching towards the sky above the Jordan Valley floor, established something equally durable: the idea that a community could build upward as well as outward, could orient itself toward the sky and the seasons and the astronomical cycles that farming had made newly important to track. Whether or not the tower was an observatory in any formal sense, it expressed an impulse toward vertical connection, toward linking the human settlement to something larger than itself, that would reappear in ziggurat and pyramid and cathedral across the following 8,000 years. What both sites leave us finally is not a blueprint and not a warning, but a record of improvisation, of human communities feeling their way without instruction through problems that had never existed before, and for which no prior experience offered reliable guidance. The people of Çatalhöyük and Jericho were not proto-Kisondim and proto-moderns in ancient clothing moving inevitably toward the cities we now inhabit. They were doing something genuinely new in conditions we can only partially reconstruct for reasons that the evidence can suggest, but not fully disclose. They made choices that served them for centuries and then stopped serving them, and they adapted or dispersed or disappeared from the record in ways that left the long-term experiment continuing without them. The walls they built are dust now, or buried under meters of accumulated earth, or standing as tourist sites beside which visitors photograph themselves without quite knowing what they are standing next to. The questions those walls were built to answer are still open. The experiment is still running. There is something in that continuity worth resting with, as this account draws toward its close not a conclusion, because the evidence does not offer one but a quality of attention. The plastered skull in the museum drawer in Ankara is still there, its shell eyes still oriented toward a ceiling. It cannot see its painted features still holding the shape of a face that someone 9,000 years ago was not ready to let go of entirely. It was maintained, it was returned to, it was kept present in a world that kept changing around it. Whatever that impulse was, the refusal to let the past become simply past, the insistence on keeping some form of connection across the threshold that death opens, it has not gone away. It has only changed its forms, found new materials, new languages, new reasons for the same essential gesture. The oldest walls still hold it, and somewhere beneath the floors of everything we have built since it is still there waiting to be carefully uncovered. The skull in the drawer in Ankara is still there. We began with it, and it is right that we return to it now, not because it answers anything, but because it has been waiting through this entire account with the particular patience of objects that outlast everyone who made them. Someone pressed shell into those eye sockets, someone mixed the plaster, shaped the cheekbones, painted the features back into legibility. Someone held it probably more than once in the specific way you hold something you're not sure how to put down. And then, at some point, they did put it down. The house continued. The settlement continued. Generations passed over the floor beneath which the rest of the body lay, and the skull remained in its niche, regarding rooms that changed slowly around it until the rooms themselves were gone and the earth came in and covered everything equally. We have spent a long time tonight moving through layers of soil, of plaster, of bone, of interpretation, and it is worth saying clearly before we leave this place that the layers do not resolve into a picture we can hold comfortably and focus. The walls of Çatalhöyük were built without a plan we can read. The tower at Jericho was built for a purpose we cannot confirm. The plastered skulls were kept for reasons that the people who kept them understood fully, and that we can only approach from outside, pressing our interpretations against a surface that gives a little, but does not open. This is the condition of all deep history, not a failure of evidence, not a problem that more excavation will necessarily solve, but a genuine property of the distance between one human world and another. The people who lived in those mudbrick rooms were as fully human as we are, as capable of irony and tenderness, and the particular exhaustion of living in close quarters with people you did not choose, and they are also in the ways that matter for understanding genuinely remote. Their reasons move through frameworks we have lost. Their silences mean things we cannot reconstruct from the objects they left behind. That remoteness is not something to resolve before you sleep. It is something to carry lightly the way you carry the awareness that the city you live in has layers beneath it that no one has excavated, that the ground under any floor has a history longer than the building above it, that the past is not behind us in any simple spatial sense, but beneath us continuous with the present in ways we rarely have occasion to feel. The first people who chose to stay, who built something meant to last, who buried their dead where they intended to remain, who shared a wall with a neighbour, and found a way to keep doing so across a lifetime when not solving a problem that has since been solved. They were beginning a negotiation that is still ongoing in every city, in every building where people sleep within earshot of one another and wake to find the arrangement still holding. There is a question that moves through all of this very quietly, without demanding an answer. Not why they built, we have followed that thread as far as it goes tonight, but what they heard in the silence of those rooms, after the hearth had burned low and the household had settled into sleep and the rooftop above them was empty of footsteps. What the darkness sounded like in a place where the dead were 3 feet below and the painted leopards were at eye level on the wall. Whether the skull in its niche was a comfort or a weight, or something for which we do not yet have the right word. Rest now, traveller. The excavation continues without you tonight. Brushes moving slowly through 9,000 years of accumulated quiet somewhere on a plain in Turkey, where the wheat grows over rooms that have not been opened since the last fire went cold. The walls remember more than we have asked them yet. The questions will be there in the morning, patient as plaster, patient as bone. For now, let the layers settle. Let the distance between your world and theirs become for a few hours simply the distance between one breath and the next, unmeasured, unworried, sufficient. Bitcoin. The oldest walls have stood this long without an answer. They will stand a little longer. Close your eyes. The ground beneath you has a history too, and it is holding you without effort the way it has always held everything placed upon it gently and for longer than anyone thought to keep count.